Welcome back to another wild ride on the board. Today we have a fascinating clash where the incredibly talented Yoseph Taher takes on the young Argentine prodigy Faustino Oro. Spoiler alert, what starts as a standard London system turns into an absolute endgame marathon. Taher opens the game with d4. Faustino develops the knight to f6. White moves the knight to f3, and black strikes the center immediately with d5. Taher brings out the dark-squared bishop to f4. This signals the London system, a super solid setup. But Faustino is not here to play passively. He immediately challenges the center with c5. White solidifies the pawn chain with c3. Black develops the knight to c6, adding pressure. White plays e3, and black pins the f3 knight by bringing the bishop to g4. Taher immediately looks to exploit the queenside. He swings the queen to b3, hitting the vulnerable b7 pawn. Faustino defends calmly by moving his queen to c8. Now, white decides to grab space and a pawn, capturing with d on c5. Black immediately damages white's pawn structure in return, capturing with the bishop on f3. White recaptures with g on f3. The kingside is completely shattered, but white is temporarily up a pawn. Faustino plays e6, preparing to recover the material on c5. White shifts the queen to a3 to hold on to that extra pawn. Black pushes a5 to restrict white's queenside expansion. White develops the knight to d2. Faustino grabs the center with e5. White moves the bishop to g5. Black maneuvers the knight to d7, eyeing that c5 pawn. White drops the queen back to b3, and Faustino finally recovers the pawn, capturing with the knight on c5. But Taher isn't done pawn hunting. He captures with the queen on d5. Faustino immediately centralizes his queen to f5, eyeing the weak f3 pawn. White develops the bishop to b5, pinning the knight on c6. Black slides the rook to c8 to break the tension. White retreats the bishop to h4. Faustino launches a massive kingside expansion with g5. White drops the bishop to g3. Black develops the bishop to e7. Taher centralizes the knight to e4, a beautiful outpost. Faustino decides to trade, capturing with the knight on e4. White recaptures with f on e4. Black's queen infiltrates to f3, creating massive dark square weaknesses in white's camp. White moves the rook to g1. Faustino castles kingside. White decides to simplify the position, capturing with the bishop on c6. Black takes back with the rook on c6. White forces a queen trade, capturing with the queen on e5. Black moves the bishop to f6, attacking the queen. White insists on the trade, moving the queen to f5. Faustino accepts the endgame, capturing with the queen on f5. White recaptures with e on f5. We are now in a highly complex endgame. White is technically up a pawn, but look at those doubled f-pawns. Black pushes b5, looking for queenside counterplay. White pushes h4 on the other side. Black responds with g4. White pushes h5. Black advances b4, trying to create weaknesses in the pawn structure. White moves the bishop to h4. Black captures with b on c3. White trades bishops, capturing with the bishop on f6. Black recaptures with the rook on f6. White grabs a pawn by capturing with the rook on g4, check. Faustino steps the king to h8. White recaptures with b on c3. Black recovers the pawn, capturing with the rook on f5. White activates the rook to h4. Black doubles up, moving the rook to c8. White defends the c3 pawn by moving the rook to c1. Black plays h6 to secure the king. Taher starts marching his king to e2. The king is a fighting piece in the endgame. Black moves the rook to c5. White pushes c4, solidifying the structure. Black brings the king to g7. White shifts the rook to h1. Black improves the king to f6. White pushes e4. Black slides the rook to g5. White's king marches forward to d3. Black centralizes the king to e6.
and Taher places his king aggressively to d4, a brilliant active king. Black retreats the rook to c8. White moves the rook to b1. Black moves the rook to c6. White invades with the rook to b5. Black moves the rook to g1. White moves the rook to h3. Black gives check by moving the rook to d1. White blocks by moving the rook to d3. Black moves the rook to c1. White attacks the rook by moving the rook to c3. Black gives check again by moving the rook to d1. White steps the king to e3. Black pushes a4, trying to create a dangerous passed pawn. White attacks it by moving the rook to a5. Black moves the rook to h1. White solidifies with f3. Black moves the rook to d6. White captures the pawn with the rook on a4. Black captures with the rook on h5. White moves the rook to a8. Black moves the rook to c6. White pushes the passed pawn a5. Black moves the rook to h1. White pushes a6. Black captures with the rook on a6. We are down to a single rook endgame. White has a very dangerous passed c-pawn. White brings the king to f4. Black plays f6. White moves the rook to c1. Black pushes h5. White advances the passed pawn c5. Black blocks it by moving the rook to c6. White moves the king to e3. Black pushes f5.
White centralizes the king to d4. Black trades pawns, capturing with f on e4. White recaptures with f on e4. Black brings the king to e7. White pushes the king to d5, attacking the rook. Black defends by moving the king to d7. White pushes the e-pawn e5. Black pushes h4. White moves the rook to h1. Black defends the pawn by moving the rook to h6. White attacks it again by moving the rook to h3. Black steps the king to c7. White pushes the passed pawn e6. Black gives check by moving the rook to h5. White steps the king to e4. And Faustino finally eliminates the dangerous c-pawn, capturing with the rook on c5. White brings the king to d4. Black moves the king to d6. White captures the h-pawn with the rook on h4. Black gives check by moving the rook to d5. White steps the king to c4. Black moves the rook to e5. White pushes the pawn e7, and black captures it with the rook on e7. Look at the board. All the pawns are gone. This is a theoretically dead-drawn king and rook versus king and rook endgame. Faustino has defended brilliantly to save the half point. White moves the king to d4. Black responds by moving the king to d7. White shifts the king to d5. Black steps back with the king to e8. White presses forward with the king to d6. Black gives check by moving the rook to d7. White slides the king to e6. Black checks again by moving the rook to e7. White moves the king to f6. Black continues the harassment by moving the rook to f7. White steps the king to g6. Black drops the rook to d7. White gives check by moving the rook to e4. Black moves the king to d8. White swings the rook to a4. Black brings the king to c7. White improves the king to f6. Black gives check by moving the rook to d6. White steps the king to e7. Black slides the rook to c6. White moves the rook to b4. Black moves the rook to b6. White gives check by moving the rook to c4. Black blocks by moving the rook to c6. White shifts the rook to a4. Black moves the rook to b6. White gives check by moving the rook to a7. Black steps the king to c6. White drops the rook to a1. Black moves the king to b5. White brings the king to d7. Black steps the king to c5. White gives check by moving the rook to c1. Black moves the king to b5. White steps the king to c7. Black swings the rook to h6. White gives check by moving the rook to b1. Black moves the king to c5. White moves the rook to e1. Black centralizes the king to d5. White moves the rook to c1, and here black gives check by moving the rook to c6. And incredibly, in this completely drawn position with 0 pawns left on the board, the game ends with a resignation from black. Whether it was a tragic mouse slip, a disconnect, or a time scramble frustration, Yoseph Taher takes the full point on paper. But the real takeaway is Faustino Oro's phenomenal defensive technique, proving that even when you're down a pawn in a grueling endgame, active defense and precise calculation can neutralize the advantage. Drop a like, subscribe for more wild chess endings, and I'll see you in the next one.